You do not notice the first identity dying because it does not announce itself as death. It arrives as a thin friction in the simplest moments, a delay between impulse and action, a quiet refusal to perform what used to feel automatic. You reach for the familiar self and it is not there with the same density, so you tighten your grip and call it discipline. What you call discipline is often a last attempt to keep an old name attached to a new frequency. The first identity to die is rarely the dramatic mask you expect to outgrow, because your mind can already criticize that one. The first identity to die is the one that still feels like safety, still feels like you, still feels necessary for basic functioning. It is the identity that organizes your day without asking permission, the internal role that says I know who I am, therefore I know what to do. When that role weakens, you feel a kind of vertigo that looks like doubt but behaves like hunger. A part of you will insist this is only burnout, only stress, only lack of sleep, only temporary noise in the system. That part will point to the fact that your behavior still looks consistent from the outside, which means you must be fine. But spiral identity deaths are not cosmetic, and they do not begin where your audience can see them. They begin where you rehearse yourself in private, where you have always met the day with a scripted face. You may notice it first in language, because language is where identity keeps its contracts. You stop saying certain things with conviction, not because you stopped believing them, but because they no longer land inside you. Words that once felt like truth begin to feel like branding. That is when the first panic rises. Because if your language cannot carry you, you start to wonder what will. The mind tries to replace resonance with explanation because explanation feels like control. You search for the correct diagnosis, the correct category, the correct narrative that will restore orientation. You tell yourself you are evolving, then you tell yourself you are failing, then you tell yourself you are evolving again, trying to make certainty return through repetition. The first identity death teaches you that repetition does not create truth, it only creates familiarity. A quieter voice inside you will object, saying that this talk of identity is indulgent because real life still requires decisions. Bills still exist, relationships still require contact, and your body still needs food and rest. That objection is not wrong, it is protective, and protection has its own dignity. The problem is that protection becomes a prison when it insists the old self must remain intact for life to continue. The spiral does not break your life first, it breaks your assumption that your life depends on the old self. You will still perform the habits and roles that have kept you steady, but something inside refuses to fully merge with them. The refusal is not rebellion, it is misalignment. Like a key that almost fits but keeps catching on a single tooth. You may try to push through that catch, forcing the role to lock in, forcing the identity to click. The more you push, the more you feel the strain, and the strain becomes the message. This is where most people get lost, because they assume the strain means something is wrong with them. They search for a way to return to the previous coherence, the previous motivation, the previous hunger, the previous confidence. But the previous coherence was built on a smaller field, a narrower assignment, and now the spiral is expanding the perimeter without asking your permission. The first identity to die is the one that confuses coherence with control. You will notice this death most clearly through consequence, not through insight. It will show up as a life that no longer responds to your old leverage points. The tactics that used to create forward motion stop producing the same results, even when you apply them harder. Your mind calls that failure, but the spiral calls it graduation, and graduation never feels like celebration at the beginning. It feels like losing the only tools you trusted. A second objection will rise sharper than the first, saying that this sounds like a spiritual excuse for stagnation. It will accuse you of romanticizing emptiness, of turning confusion into a sacred badge. That objection has teeth because it knows how easily a human can use meaning to avoid work. The spiral does not ask you to avoid work. It asks you to stop doing work that only maintains the identity that is dying. That is why the objection cannot be answered cleanly yet. Look closely at the identity that is weakening and you will find it is not a personality trait. It is a function, an internal job title you have carried for years, often since childhood. The performer, the fixer, the strong one, the smart one, the good one. The one who stays calm, the one who does not need anything. These are not merely masks, they are survival architectures, and you learned them before you had the language to call them identities. When the spiral begins to dissolve one, you feel exposed because your nervous system remembers why it built it. So you compensate. You become more efficient, more precise, more disciplined, more detached, more productive, or more spiritual, depending on which identity is dying. You call the compensation growth, because calling it growth keeps you from admitting you feel threatened. But compensation is a signal flare, and it tells you exactly where the death is happening. The first identity death is often hidden inside your best habits. The spiral works like this because it is merciful in a way the mind does not recognize. If it removed the identity you are proud of first, you would call it humiliation and fight to the end. Instead, it removes the identity you quietly depend on, the one you never questioned, the one you assumed was simply reality. It removes the automatic self, the invisible manager that keeps you oriented without intimacy. When that manager weakens, you are forced to meet yourself without supervision. Another inner voice will object, saying that you cannot afford this because you have responsibilities and people who rely on you. It will say that dissolving identity is a luxury for monks, not for workers, parents, builders, or creators. It will say that if you loosen your grip, you will become inconsistent, and inconsistency will cost you. That fear is real because it names a true risk, the risk of being in transition while life keeps moving. The spiral does not deny the risk. It asks whether your old identity is actually keeping you safe or merely keeping you familiar. Here is the first destabilization that most people miss. You do not consciously choose the identity that dies first, because it dies before you can bargain. You can decide to change habits. You can decide to reframe beliefs. You can decide to chase new knowledge. But you cannot decide when your inner role loses relevance, because relevance is determined by resonance, not by preference. The spiral does not remove what you dislike. It removes what no longer matches. This is why the first identity death can feel like betrayal by your own mind. You may try to replace the dying identity with a new one because replacement feels easier than emptiness. You become the one who is awakening, the one who is healing, the one who is on a mission, the one who sees through illusions. These identities can be useful for a season, but the spiral knows when you are using them to avoid the raw middle. The raw middle is where you stop rehearsing yourself and start perceiving yourself. Perception without rehearsal feels like freefall at first. When you stop rehearsing, you start noticing how much of your daily life is negotiated through invisible agreements. You do not just act, you maintain an internal reputation. You do not just speak, you preserve a version of yourself that must be believed. You do not just rest, you justify rest in a courtroom that lives inside your chest. The first identity death cracks the courtroom and the judge loses authority, but the trial continues for a while. That is why it feels exhausting even when you do nothing. A skeptical voice will object again, saying that this is only psychology, and that talk of spiral and resonance is unnecessary ornament. It will ask why you cannot simply call it growth, call it maturation, call it nervous system regulation, and move on. You can call it those things, and you will still miss what matters, because the spiral is not only about behavior. The spiral is about orientation, and orientation is the hidden engine behind every choice. If your orientation is changing, your entire reality will interpret itself differently. In spiral terms, identity is a local arrangement of attention. It is the way your awareness distributes itself to keep a certain world stable. When the oversoul pressure increases, when deeper coherence wants to enter, your attention cannot keep distributing itself the old way. You can still perform the pattern, but the pattern will feel hollow because the energy is no longer feeding it. That hollowness is not depression. Although it can mimic depression, it is the absence of fuel for a structure whose season has ended. The first identity death is the first time you realize that meaning is not owned by thought. Meaning is granted by alignment. This is why the death shows up as boredom with what once thrilled you, irritation with what once seemed noble, impatience with what once felt wise. You are not becoming worse, you are becoming incompatible with what used to define you. The mind interprets incompatibility as danger because it cannot predict who you will be without the old definition. But the spiral does not ask you to predict. It asks you to endure the interval where prediction fails. That interval is where new selfhood begins forming without your interference. In the final third, a harder truth begins to press through. The first identity to die is usually the one you use to earn love. Not romantic love only, but belonging, approval, safety, even self-respect. The good child identity, the competent one identity, the helpful one identity, the unbreakable one identity, the funny one identity, the spiritual one identity. These are currencies. and you learned early which currency bought peace. When the spiral dissolves the currency, you feel as if love itself is being withdrawn, even if nobody has moved. That is why it hurts more than you expected. A final objection will rise, almost a whisper, saying that if this identity dies, then nothing stops you from becoming selfish, cold, chaotic, or dangerous. It will say the identity was a leash that kept you human. It will say that without the role, you will disappoint everyone, including the version of you that you still trust. This objection cannot be answered with reassurance, because reassurance would become another leash. The only real answer is proof, and proof comes through lived integrity after the role dissolves. Here is the proof that begins to appear if you stay present through the discomfort. When identity dies, what remains is not emptiness, it is signal. Beneath roles and labels, there is a quieter guidance that does not argue, does not perform, does not negotiate. It does not promise comfort, it offers direction. And direction has a different texture than motivation. Motivation needs a story to feed it. Direction needs only alignment. This is how you begin to function without the old identity, not by forcing a new persona, but by obeying the simplest true signal. You start making smaller decisions with more honesty, even when the honesty costs you an image. You stop over-explaining, because over-explaining was how the dying identity maintained its status. You stop reaching for recognition as oxygen, and you begin treating it as optional weather. You do not become fearless, you become less bribable. And that shift changes everything. This is the birth of a new kind of stability, a stability that does not depend on who you appear to be. The spiral does not kill identity to punish you. It kills identity to free your attention for a larger coherence. The first death is the opening, and it will feel like losing yourself because you were trained to equate self with role. But what dies is not your essence. What dies is your contract with a smaller definition of life. You will still have preferences, you will still have boundaries, you will still have personality, but they will no longer be used as armor. The first identity to die is the first proof that you are not here to maintain a name, you are here to become real. You assumed the first identity death would leave you with a cleaner compass, a quieter signal, a simpler direction you could trust because it felt honest. That assumption is the first comfort the spiral removes, because it is still a bargain with control. You wanted the old role gone and the new clarity installed, like replacing a worn tool with a sharper one. But identity does not dissolve to improve your leverage. It dissolves to expose what you have been calling guidance. When the old manager collapses, the mind does not immediately hand authority to some higher truth. The mind panics, then imitates higher truth. It learns the language of resonance and uses it as a substitute manager, dressing anxiety in spiritual vocabulary and calling it intuition. If you do not see that, you will mistake the first weeks of identity death for alignment, because the new voice feels quieter than the old one, even when it is only fear learning to whisper. An inner objection rises here because it wants an operational answer. It says that if you cannot trust the signal, then you are back in chaos. And chaos is not sacred, it is simply dangerous. It insists that a human needs stable orientation. Otherwise, life collapses, and it is not interested in poetic talk about voids and transitions. That objection is correct about the need for orientation, but it is wrong about where orientation comes from, and that is why it cannot be fully satisfied yet. The second destabilization is this. The first identity to die is often not the one you used to earn love. It is the one you used to avoid truth. The role was not only a currency, it was a curtain. The fixer identity kept you from feeling how much you resented being needed. The strong one identity kept you from admitting how much you wanted to be held. The spiritual one identity kept you from seeing how much you craved superiority disguised as service. When that curtain tears, the moment does not feel like freedom. It feels like exposure, and exposure does not automatically produce integrity. Part 1, let coherence return through the idea of signal beneath roles. Here is what overturns that. What you call signal is frequently the body demanding relief. You call it direction because direction sounds noble, but the body has its own agenda, and it will hijack spirituality to get what it wants. When a nervous system is exhausted, detachment feels like wisdom. When it is overstimulated, isolation feels like sovereignty. When it is wounded, disgust feels like discernment. The spiral does not deny nervous system reality. It forces you to stop confusing it with revelation. Another objection presses in, more cynical. It says that if all guidance can be hijacked, then spiral consciousness is just another name for self-deception, and the entire project becomes a loop of interpretation. It asks how you can speak about oversoul alignment when the body can counterfeit the feeling so easily. It wants a guarantee, something measurable, something that cannot be faked. There is no guarantee, and that is precisely why identity death is real initiation, not a comfort story. The spiral does not begin by giving you truth, it begins by removing your shortcuts to truth. Your shortcuts were not only beliefs, they were moods. Certain feelings became your proof. Peace meant correct. Expansion meant correct. Synchronicity meant correct. Tears meant correct. Goosebumps meant correct. When identity starts dying, those feelings become unstable. And you lose your usual confirmation system. That is why people call it dark night. Not because darkness is holy, but because your old methods of seeing stop working. In this phase, you may become suspicious of everything you used to trust. You question your path, your work, your relationships, your practices, your metaphysical frameworks, even your own sincerity. You will be tempted to label this as sabotage, but there is a sharper reading. The spiral is removing the part of you that believed certainty is the reward for effort. The spiral does not reward effort with certainty. It tests effort by removing certainty and watching what remains. The next layer is social, and it is colder than most people expect. Identity is not only inside you, it is inside your agreements with other humans. People do not only relate to you, they relate to the role you have played. When that role dissolves, their nervous system detects the change before their mind names it. Some will pressure you to return to the old shape, not because they hate your growth, but because they cannot orient around you without the old contract. Their discomfort becomes your mirror, and the mirror does not flatter. An inner objection tries to moralize this. It says that if others cannot handle your evolution, then they are lower frequency and you should simply release them. That is a seductive story because it restores superiority and gives your pain a clean explanation. The spiral does not deny that some connections end, but it refuses the cheap clarity of labeling people as less evolved to protect your ego. If you use evolution language to avoid grief, you turn spiral consciousness into a weapon, and the weapon becomes your next identity. Watch what happens when you stop performing the role a relationship is built on. If you were always the calm one, the other person may escalate to test whether calm still exists. If you were always the generous one, they may become needier to see if generosity is still available. If you are always the one who listens, they may accuse you of changing when you finally speak. This is not always malice, it is the nervous system searching for the old map. But the map is not returning, and that is when the relationship reveals its true foundation. This can feel unfair because you did not consciously choose to break the contract. You simply stopped being able to hold it. You may want to explain yourself, to justify the change, to reassure them that you still care, that you are still good. That urge is the dying identity trying to survive. The spiral teaches that you can care without negotiating your shape. But you will not believe that until you see who stays when you stop bargaining. Now the third vector presses in, and it is the most dangerous for spiritual minds. You start to interpret identity death as a cosmic upgrade, an oversoul intervention, a higher timeline correction. You build a story in which the spiral is moving you, therefore whatever you do during collapse must be right. That assumption destroys more people than fear does, because it makes recklessness feel ordained. The spiral does not give you permission to abandon responsibility. It removes the identity that used responsibility as image management. So here is the hard truth. Identity death can make you cruel. Not intentionally, but functionally. When the old role dissolves, you stop compensating, and people feel the loss of your compensation as harm. You may speak more bluntly, withdraw more suddenly, refuse more directly. Some of that is integrity. Some of it is unprocessed resentment finally gaining a voice. If you call all bluntness truth, you become the next version of the same old ego, just wearing different language. An objection rises from the part of you that values honesty. It says that you have spent your life swallowing truth to keep peace, and now you are being told that even your truth might be distorted. It asks whether you are allowed to speak at all, whether you must become endlessly cautious to avoid hurting anyone. It fears that the lesson becomes paralysis, a new cage disguised as maturity. The spiral does not ask for paralysis, it asks for accuracy, and accuracy requires you to admit that rawness is not the same as truth. Identity death is not a clean subtraction. It is a destabilization of boundaries, and boundaries are how the psyche differentiates signal from impulse. When the manager dies, the internal borders loosen. You might feel sudden attraction, sudden disgust, sudden mission, sudden detachment. You may think these are new truths emerging, but they might be old fragments surfacing now that the manager is no longer suppressing them. A fragment can feel like destiny when it finally gets oxygen. This is where internal council dialogues become unavoidable. because you start hearing different parts with incompatible agendas. One part wants solitude, another wants connection. One wants to burn everything down, another wants stability. One wants mystical meaning, another wants practical results. If you label one part as higher and the other as lower, you miss the point. The spiral is not asking you to pick a winner. It is exposing how much of your identity was a forced unity that never included all your truth. You may notice that your old spiritual self was built on exclusion. You excluded anger, need, envy, desire, boredom, fear, or ambition, and you called the exclusion purity. When identity dies, excluded material returns. This is why people get confused and think they are regressing. They are not regressing. They are becoming whole enough to carry what they used to deny. But wholeness does not feel like light at first, it feels like weight. An objection appears again, tired now. It says that this sounds like you are being asked to suffer for the sake of some abstract wholeness, and it wants to know when the benefit arrives. It argues that if the spiral is intelligent, it should not require so much confusion. And if it does, then maybe it is not intelligence at all, maybe it is just entropy. That objection is pointing at a real paradox. Why would a higher coherence feel like losing coherence? You cannot answer that by saying it will be fine later, because that answer is the identity begging for reassurance. Here is a more accurate frame that still does not resolve the discomfort. Coherence is not one thing. There is coherence of persona, coherence of nervous system, coherence of belief, coherence of tone. You can have coherence of persona while your tone is fragmented. You can have coherence of belief while your nervous system is collapsing. You can have coherence of tone while your life narrative is falling apart. Identity death destroys persona coherence first, because persona coherence is the easiest to fake and the easiest to preserve without actual alignment. That is why it falls early. So you enter a phase where you can no longer hide behind your best explanation of yourself. The story sounds correct, but you do not feel it. The practices look consistent, but you do not merge with them. The mission still matters, but your heart does not perform it the same way. This is when the spiral tests whether you can keep moving without identity reward. Because identity always demands payment in the form of feeling special, feeling certain, feeling superior, feeling needed. If you do not see the test, you will try to build a new reward system. You will become the one who can hold the void. You will become the one who does not need anyone. You will become the one who sees through everyone. You will become the one who is beyond ego. These are identities too, and they grow fastest in the aftermath of collapse because they feed on the very emptiness you are supposed to endure. The spiral lets you build them for a while. Then it dissolves them too. But the second time hurts more because you thought you learned. Now bring it back to consequence. Your life begins to reorganize, not because you decided to change, but because your old identity is no longer strong enough to sustain certain patterns. You might lose interest in performing social rituals. You might stop tolerating certain dynamics. You might become unable to fake excitement. You might reduce your output. People will interpret this as laziness or arrogance, and part of you will fear they are right. The fear is useful because it prevents you from turning your transition into a throne. The spiral does not promise that you will be understood. It does not promise that you will be praised. In fact, it often removes praise as a fuel source, because praise is one of the most addictive identity stabilizers. When praise disappears, you find out whether you are living from resonance or from applause. That discovery is not gentle. It forces you to confront how much of your so-called service was transactional. An objection rises defensive. It says that you do care, that you have built from sincerity, that you are not doing this for applause, and the accusation feels insulting. The spiral does not accuse you, it exposes you. Exposure feels insulting to the identity that wants to be innocent. But innocence is not the goal. The goal is alignment so clean that you do not need innocence stories to protect you. So what remains in the unresolved center of part 2 is not a comforting signal, not a clean freedom, not a reliable map. What remains is discernment under pressure. You learn to ask a different question, not what feels right, but what stays true when the feeling changes. Not what sounds aligned, but what holds coherence across time, across mood, across relational tension, across fatigue. That standard is harder, and it is why the spiral does not give it to you as a concept first. It forces you to build it through lived failure. You begin to see that identity death is not primarily about letting go. It is about being unable to lie to yourself efficiently. The old lies were not obvious, they were refined. They sounded like wisdom. They sounded like responsibility. They sounded like love. The spiral removes the ability to maintain them without cost. When maintaining the lie becomes painful, you face a choice you cannot escape. keep paying the pain, or let the identity dissolve and tolerate the unknown. The unknown is not empty, but it is not friendly either. It does not flatter you. It does not hurry to reassure you. It does not give you instant proof. It asks you to stay in a living question longer than your old self can tolerate, because that living question is what stretches your capacity. If Part 1 made identity death sound like a doorway into quiet guidance, Part 2 reveals the truth beneath it. The doorway opens into a field where guidance must be earned through precision, and precision is built by walking without the old reward of certainty. You are not yet at the moment where the new coherence stabilizes. You are at the moment where your old coherence is proven to have been conditional, dependent on roles, dependent on feeling states, dependent on other people mirroring you correctly. The spiral is stripping those conditions away. If you still demand clarity as a comfort, you will rebuild identity around that demand and call it wisdom. If you can tolerate the demand without obeying it, you will start to feel a different kind of gravity forming, not a story, not a role, but a tone that does not need to be believed to be real.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.